Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to PSW's podcast series. Through this podcast, we shall bring to you exciting aspects of Pakistan's trade and transit economy and also discuss the relevant issues with experts of trade and economy. I'm Varela representing Pakistan's Single Window, and I shall be your host for today's Trade Talks. We shall be discussing Pakistan's economic crisis, and we shall also try to find an answer to the question, can international trade help? We are joined today by Gonzalo Varela. Dr. Varela is a senior economist in the macroeconomics, trade and investment global practice of the World Bank. He is currently based in Islamabad, where he leads the trade program of World Bank. Dr. Varela has an impressive career, having worked in the World Bank's Global Trade Unit in Washington and the Ministry of Industries of Uruguay, as well as the private sector. He has taught at the University of Sussex, the University of Pisa, and the University of Trento in Italy. He holds a PhD in economics from Sussex, and his work has been published in peer-reviewed journals, books, and reports. Mr. Varela, a very warm welcome to Trade Talks.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Dr. Varela, we are all feeling the heat of the economic crisis in which Pakistan finds itself in as of now. And quoting some figures, the trade deficit during the 11 months of the fiscal year 2021 to 22, according to the Pakistan Bureau of Statistics, has swollen to a record $43.4 billion. In fact, we have seen a regular trend of increasing trade deficit. So how do you view this trend? And do you have some ideas to tackle the current economic crisis? Although this might be a difficult question to cover very briefly, but still the major solutions that you have in mind.
It is a difficult question, right? It is a difficult question. And I agree that the increases in the trade deficit raises some red flags. In principle, a trade deficit is not necessarily something bad per se. You can have an economy that is very dynamic, and an economy that is very dynamic is going to import a lot of machinery and equipment, for example. So that economy will see imports growing fast and may see a trade deficit. But at the same time as seeing a trade deficit, you will also see that the growth prospects will increase. So investors will perceive that there will be growth in the future, and so they are going to be willing to finance that trade deficit. Then another situation is when the trade deficit is caused by high levels of consumption, public or private, and low level of saving. In that case, you see imports growing because consumption or public expenditures are growing, and that increases demand for imports. But not necessarily growth prospects are increasing too, and so investors are going to be a little bit more wary about financing that trade deficit. So what we see in Pakistan now, it seems more related to the second scenario than with the first scenario. A lot of public sector-led consumption growth, so large fiscal deficits that push import demand up. And in the middle of that, that's a structural problem in Pakistan. You see that happening over the last 2 decades. But what happens now, what is special now, is that sort of hostile external environment that you see with very fast increasing commodity prices that Pakistan needs to import, thinking oil, cooking oil, many food products and fuels. And raising interest rates that make financing costs much higher. So that combination is not very good for the trade deficit of Pakistan and for the financing of the trade deficit of Pakistan. In fact, from our numbers, what we see is that 60% of the increase in imports during fiscal year 22 is related to increases in prices. So it's not quantity of imports that are growing, it's prices because of the fast growing international prices. So what to do? You can think the easy and the tempting solution is saying, okay, imports are growing fast, let's curb imports by putting import restrictions. Import bans, cash margin requirements that the central bank can introduce, or import licensings. Those are solutions that are pseudo solutions. They won't work. They won't work because at the same time as reducing imports, they will also reduce exports. Import restrictions act like export restrictions in disguise. They create an environment in which firms prefer to sell in the domestic market because they are curtailing import competition, and so they will reorient away from exporting into selling the domestic market. what is the more structural solution? Well, the more structural solution is to address the ultimate driver of the trade deficit that has to do with large fiscal deficits. So the talk of the town is the fuel subsidy, and the fuel subsidy has been reversed in the last weeks. So pricing fuels right according to what it costs internationally is important while preserving the livelihoods of the most vulnerable part of the population. But it's not just about the fuel subsidy. So fiscal consolidation, a serious fiscal consolidation, examination of what are those public sector expenditures that could actually be reduced, or those subsidies or tax exemptions that are given that are not reaching the poorest but are reaching perhaps the elites. That is a more sustainable way of addressing the challenge of the trade deficit, I would say.
Can we turn to the private sector for a moment? From the private sector's perspective, the lack of trade competitiveness of firms and their products has been a constant challenge for the private sector. It's almost for you, it's a half a decade experience with Pakistani stakeholders. So what would you suggest? What policies, what solutions would you suggest for making them more competitive, for taking this, for addressing this challenge of competitiveness?
So when one thinks about trade competitiveness, competitiveness may mean many things, but ultimately, the ultimate driver of trade competitiveness is productivity. Productivity, right? So firms need to get better at what they do. They need to produce more with the same resources, or the same with fewer resources. That's what productivity means, being more efficient in the use of resources. So the most important policy priority for boosting trade competitiveness, private sector level, should be boosting the productivity of firms. And for that, one can think of as a context, an ecosystem that is conducive for productivity upgrading, and that ecosystem needs to have one key feature, that is that there is a level playing field across all firms in the economy, that there are not some firms or sectors that are highly privileged, because if that is the case, then that comes at the expense of others that are going to be outside the net of benefits, that are not going to be able to join that platform of exporting or becoming good at something. And then at the same time, you have those that are inside the net, so the insiders that are receiving all the benefits, that are going to have little incentives to actually upgrade productivity because they receive so many support funds from here or there, that their incentives to become better at what they do falls. I can give you a couple of examples, perhaps. So the government of Pakistan actually spends a lot of money in supporting firms, but it does so in a way that is very targeted to specific sectors and specific firms. The DLTL and the DDT, that are two export subsidy schemes, for example, are heavily tilted in favor of the textile and apparel sector, for example. So that gives space for the textile and apparel sector, so that gives some comfort to the textile and apparel sector, not necessarily to upgrade productivity, but to remain on lower levels of productivity, because with the subsidy they can still compete internationally. The textile and apparel sector receives not only those two export subsidies, but for example, a lot of subsidized financing from the State Bank Pakistan, refinancing schemes for exporters. In some cases, there have been energy subsidies too that are targeted to the textile sector. So these type of subsidies help firms in a specific sector, right? And that creates a distortion that is harmful for the rest of the firms in other sectors. And to those that are receiving the subsidies, the incentives to upgrade productivity falls. So what we probably need is a level playing field in which support doesn't discriminate between sectors, that is more horizontal, so that there are incentives for firms to become better at what they do, and that is going to be a crucial element to upgrade productivity and therefore competitiveness in export markets.
Right. So, providing a level playing field to all stakeholders, all trade sectors is the most pertinent thing to do right now. Thank you so much for this elaborate answer. Moving to the next question, I would like to say that Pakistan's firms are not very well integrated with the global value chains, as you are aware. So, do you have any short-term, medium-term, and long-term suggestions to better integrate the Pakistani firms with global value chain?
I would say, in the short term, reduce trade costs. In the medium term, reduce trade costs. And in the long term, reduce trade costs. Why do I say this? Okay. Because what is the story about global value chains? So go far, back in time, 100 years. I don't know how much time we have. I'm going to go back 100 years. And there, what you had 100 years ago was that there was a separation, perhaps 200 years ago yet. Because transport costs were very high, people produced in their household whatever they consume, right? Mm-hmm. So you had subsistence type of production, subsistence agriculture, etc. Then transport costs fell. And with transport costs falling, then you had trade booming, right? Because then you could produce in one place, consume in the other. It was easy to bring the produce from wherever it was produced to wherever it was consumed. Then fast forward to 50 years ago, what happens was that communication costs fell. And with communication costs falling, then what firms realized was that they could actually set parts of the production process in different countries and coordinate everything, because calling, video calls, even flying, the cost of that fell, and therefore they could coordinate a production network across countries. So that technological change of a reduction in communication costs and transport and communication costs meant what made that possible was that, say, for example, the producer of a mobile phone now is producing the screen in a particular country where it's cheapest, the chips in a particular country where it's the cheapest, the camera somewhere else, and it's assembling it somewhere else. That was made possible by technology, but once you make that possible, the forces of comparative advantages make that the production costs of producing that way are very low. So it's made possible by technology, it's made inevitable by competition. So if you want to compete, you need to structure your production according to comparative advantage, breaking the production process, fragmenting the production process across countries. The implication of that is that then the goods, the parts that are inside this mobile phone that gets traded are produced in different countries, and so they need to cross borders many times before it reaches the stage of the final good being produced. That means that a crucial element in the competitiveness of the production of this phone or whatever other product that gets produced in international production networks or global value chains is that the costs of crossing borders is as low as possible. And this is why I said trade cost reduction, trade cost reduction, trade cost reduction. That's what you need for Pakistan to join global value chains. You need, let me break down trade costs into three actionable things. The first most important trade cost is the cost of gathering information. And here, trade information portals have gone great lengths at facilitating this process because they bring all information in an online platform. Pakistan has recently launched a trade information portal. So that reduces the cost of the potential trade. You say, okay, what is it that I need to import or export? Export from Pakistan to the world or import from Pakistan. That gathering of information in an online platform reduces trade costs substantially. So that's one part of the story, the information costs. The other part of the story is the costs that are brought by trade policy. So are there tariffs that are high? In Pakistan, we have customs duties, but we also have regulatory duties and we have additional customs duties. So these three tariffs and para-tariffs increase trade costs. So gradually reducing them is going to be important so that you can participate in global value chains. The third part of the story is actually crossing the border and the cost of crossing the border. This is where trade facilitation comes as a very important element. Customs has a lot to say here and has a lot to do to actually reduce this this trade cost. So I would say that's the agenda to join global value chains. Reduce trade costs in these three dimensions.
Moving towards women in trade, I would say that the Pakistani government has taken several women-specific initiatives for encouraging them to engage in trade and businesses. But still, recent evidence suggests that they have not most of the women have not graduated to the export level. So what suggestions do you have for women entrepreneurs so they can work in the export sector and their businesses in the export sector can be promoted?
This is a very interesting question. It's a tough one to answer. I'm not an expert on gender issues, so I will be cautious in the how much certainty I add to my answer. But I would say you can think about this in two stages. First stage is building a pipeline, right? So ensuring that women reach the stage of becoming entrepreneurs. Forget about the exporting side for the moment, right? But encouraging the participation of women in the marketplace. This is crucial. Pakistan actually pays a huge opportunity cost by having such a low level of female labor force participation and female participation in the entrepreneurial ecosystem. That's a huge opportunity cost there that Pakistan faces. So ensuring that women reach the stage of becoming entrepreneurs is very important. There is some evidence out there from other countries on competitions. For example, there are some entrepreneurial development plans in which you have competitions on business plan development. And the evidence there is mixed. There are some cases in which you have good results, and out of this business development plan support schemes, you have a lot of entrepreneurs that actually succeed. These are examples that could be implemented in sort of small scope pilots. So there's a lot of trial and error here, and we need to learn what is it that works, what is it that doesn't. So pilot small scale programs of this sort to build the capabilities of entrepreneurs with a focus on females, and then you bring them into the export stage. So that's one area. Another area is another challenge, and also from international experience, what we know is that in many cases women face a lot of challenges when having to deal with government officials in different parts of the export process, and customs crossing borders can be very challenging, particularly for small-scale exporters that are female-owned. And this is where any sort of interventions that digitalizes the process of getting licenses, approvals, is something that is positive for gender inclusiveness, for inclusiveness of more women in this export ecosystem. The Pakistan single window is an example of a positive development in this front. But let me just finish answering your question by saying probably this is a question that is worth asking to female entrepreneurs, because they will be the ones that are going to be able to say with much more confidence and much more information and knowledge what is it that is ultimately the challenges that they face.
You talked about Pakistan's single window. So this is my final question to you, that what do you think are the long-term effects of the improved public service delivery through the platform of Pakistan single window on our overall trade of Pakistan?
So the single windows in general are a very good idea. They're a great idea. And this is why WTO trade facilitation agreement encourages the development of single windows. It's a requirement for the trade facilitation agreement to WTO. Now, I would say there are two main benefits of this. The first one is that when you sit on the same table, all of the agencies different agencies, right? That, and that they will need to coordinate on the issue of how are we going to treat this request, to move across the border this consignment. Okay, this is the form, and all of the different agencies are going to sit together. The first thing that you benefit from is policy coordination in a way that you don't have if these agencies are sitting somewhere else, right? And you have to, and that enhances the whole process, the whole vision of these agencies of how, and they see what is the, why this is important, why they need to coordinate. So there's an element there of benefit with the single window schemes that has to do with policy coordination becoming better. So that's a good thing for policy making in general. Now, the second thing that happens is that if well implemented, trade costs fall dramatically. So the evidence that we have on this, or at least the most comprehensive that I know, is a recent paper by Martinez, Arzoso, and others that takes 176 countries, about 44 of them that have actually implemented national single window schemes, the rest that haven't. And what she shows is that countries that have implemented national single windows show increases in bilateral trade flows. So if you have two countries that both have national single windows, by 37%. So that's a large increase in trade associated with national single windows. So that implies implicitly that trade costs fall. And that's a crucial thing that you need to integrate in global value chains. And global value chains are crucial for upgrading productivity. And upgrading productivity is crucial for growth. So Pakistan's single window, if properly implemented, can be a good conduit for productivity upgrading and ultimately growth. But it needs to be properly implemented. And so let me finish with this. What do we know about implementation of single window schemes in a successful way? You need a very strong political will so that all agencies involved know that there's no way back on this, right? They will need to coordinate. No other option. There's no fallback option on this. And second is that there's constant monitoring and evaluation with milestones well defined so that you can better see what you're doing, how well you're doing, and if you're not doing that well, then go back and say, okay, where did we go wrong and how can we fix it? So monitoring and evaluation is crucial, and political will should always be.
That is very important, political will, as you said, in the proper implementation of Pakistan's single window and single windows everywhere. Thank you very much for your invaluable insights today. And PSW and STPI want to thank you wholeheartedly for coming today here and for sparing your time for us. Thank you, everyone, and keep watching PSW podcast.